My name is Marin. I am 34 years old, a widowed mother of two, and until a freezing Tuesday afternoon, I still foolishly believed that blood meant something. I was a freelance architectural drafter working out of a small suburban house, pouring every ounce of my energy into raising my 7-year-old son Leo and my 5-year-old daughter Maya. Life had been a relentless uphill battle since my husband passed away, but I always tried to keep the peace with my mother Delia, my stepfather Graham, and my golden child half-sister Veda. I thought if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, they would eventually respect me. That delusion shattered the moment I returned home from a grueling, deeply secretive trip to Boston. Holding our two kids' hands, I rushed home to tell my parents I just inherited $40 million and a commercial tower in Boston from my estranged biological father. The legal meetings had been a whirlwind of signed documents and shocking revelations. I was exhausted but practically vibrating with a newfound hope. I wanted to walk through my front door, hug my mother, and finally tell her that our financial struggles were over forever. But as I dragged my tired feet up my own driveway, I did not find a warm welcome. Instead, my parents and my sister were waiting on the front porch with eviction papers. Stacked neatly around their feet were cardboard boxes filled with my entire life. Veda stood at the top of the stairs, sipping from a glass of expensive red wine. She smirked down at me, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Pack your bags," she sneered, tossing the crisp legal documents onto the concrete path. "This house has no room for a peasant." The word peasant echoed in the cold air, striking me right in the chest. That single sentence encapsulated 34 years of enduring profound emotional abuse. It was the exact same tone she used 5 years ago when my mother forced me to give up my master bedroom so Veda could use it as a home office for her new real estate technology startup. Delia had looked me dead in the eye and said that Voda's vision was more important than my comfort. It was the same dripping condescension Graham used when he pressured me into draining my meager emergency savings to buy custom mapping software for Voda's business, promising she would pay me back tenfold. She never did. And it was the exact same mocking laughter I heard last Thanksgiving when Veda publicly humiliated me in front of our extended family, calling my architectural drafting career a little drawing hobby meant for people who lacked true ambition. I was the invisible child, the workhorse expected to silently support the family, while Veda was paraded around as the brilliant tech founder. I stood on the driveway, feeling the small, trembling hands of my children gripping mine. Maya hid behind my leg, terrified by the harsh tone of her grandmother and aunt. I looked at my mother, desperately searching for a shred of maternal defense. Delia simply crossed her arms and looked away. Graham adjusted his expensive jacket, avoiding my gaze entirely. They were fully complicit in throwing a widowed mother and 2 young children onto the street. Veda took another sip of her wine, enjoying the silent shock on my face. "We are selling this property, Marin," she announced loudly, making sure the nosy neighbors could hear. "My startup is expanding. We are securing massive venture capital funding next month in Boston, and I need liquid cash right now to cover some operational costs." Mom and Dad agreed that holding on to this suburban dump so you can play house is a waste of their equity. "You have 30 days to find an apartment you can actually afford on your meager drafting income." I did not scream. I did not cry. A terrifying sense of calm washed over my entire body. I smiled. "Okay." Vada's smug expression faltered. She lowered her wine glass, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is so funny?" she snapped, her voice losing its composed edge. I squeezed my children's hands gently, reassuring them, before taking a deliberate step toward the porch. I let go of my heavy travel bag and reached slowly into my coat pocket. Veda thought I was reaching for my house keys to surrender them. My mother finally looked at me, expecting to see the defeated, compliant daughter she had molded for decades. But the woman standing on that driveway was dead. I was no longer the sacrificial lamb of this toxic family. I kept my eyes locked directly on Voda's face, waiting for the exact moment her arrogant world would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. What I pulled out of my pocket was not a set of brass keys. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope bearing the embossed seal of a prestigious Boston law firm. The parchment paper inside felt incredibly solid in my hands. I walked up the first 2 steps of the porch, forcing Veda to take a slight step backward. "What is that?" Graham demanded, stepping forward to protect his golden child. "Are you trying to hand us some pathetic counteroffer, Marin? Because we are not negotiating. My name is on the mortgage documents. I pay the property taxes. We are selling the house and you are leaving." "You are incredibly good at making loud demands, Graham," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet suburban lawn. "But you have always been terrible at reading the fine print." I pulled a stapled packet from the envelope and held it up in the crisp autumn air. "Do you remember 8 years ago when you and Mom bought this house? You had terrible credit because you had just co-signed a massive loan for Voda's first failed business venture. You could not qualify for a traditional bank mortgage, so you went through a private lending firm called Oakwood Holdings. They approved you immediately with incredibly favorable terms, no questions asked." Graham crossed his arms, his posture growing rigid. "Yes, I pay the holding company every single month. That means I have equity. What is your point, Marin? Stop stalling and get off the porch." My smile widened, reaching my eyes this time. "My point is that Oakwood Holdings is not just some random real estate management firm. It is a blind limited liability company created exactly 9 years ago by a man named Arthur Vance. That man was my biological father." The color drained from Delia's face so fast she looked physically ill. "What are you talking about?" my mother gasped, clutching the porch railing for support. "Your father was a deadbeat. He lived in a tiny apartment. He never had any money." "My father was a recluse," I corrected her smoothly. "He was eccentric and difficult, but he was also a quiet, brilliant investor who amassed a massive fortune. He knew exactly how you treated me, Mom. He knew you would eventually try to take everything from me to fund Voda's delusions of grandeur. So, he bought this property through an anonymous limited liability company to ensure I would always have a roof over my head. He held the deed the entire time. And as of this morning in Boston, I officially inherited Oakwood Holdings." Veda choked on her wine, coughing violently as the red liquid splashed onto the wooden porch boards. She stared at me, her eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. "You are lying," she gasped, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "That is legally impossible. Graham is on the mortgage." "There is no mortgage," I stated flatly, stepping up to the top of the porch and thrusting the heavy documents directly into Graham's chest. "Read it yourself. Those are the deed transfer documents formally establishing my sole ownership of the limited liability company and this entire property. You do not have equity, Graham. You have been paying me rent for 8 years." Graham snatched the papers from my hands. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon, searching for a loophole, a mistake, any sign that this was a bluff. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. The arrogant patriarch persona evaporated, leaving behind a terrified man realizing he had just lost his greatest financial asset. "No, this cannot be real," Graham muttered, flipping the pages with trembling fingers. "You cannot do this to us." "I did not do anything to you, Graham," I replied, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I simply stopped playing the role of your compliant little victim." I turned my attention to Veda, who was looking frantically between her father and the documents. "And you," I said, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "You just handed me an eviction notice and told me to pack my bags. But considering you just packed all of my belongings into cardboard boxes and tried to throw my children onto the street, I am revoking your welcome immediately. You are officially trespassing on my private property." Veda practically threw her wine glass onto the small patio table, her hands shaking visibly. She took a step back, hiding behind Delia's shoulder. "Mom, do something," Veda whined, her voice reverting to that of a spoiled child. "Tell her she cannot do this." Delia stepped forward, forcing a trembling, entirely fake smile onto her face. "Marin, sweetie, let us just go inside and talk about this over a cup of tea. We are family. We can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone. Veda really needs the capital right now, and you have so much more than you need." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed the local police precinct directly. Yes, hello, my name is Marin. I am calling from Elmwood Drive. I have a situation at my residence. 3 individuals are currently trespassing on my property and harassing my children. I am the sole legal owner of the home, and I need an officer to escort them off the premises immediately. Marin, hang up the phone right now, Graham yelled, lunging forward. I took a swift step back, shielding Leo and Maya behind my legs. The police are already on their way, I said calmly. Gather your things and get off my porch. The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in public humiliation. When the black and white patrol car rolled up the driveway with its lights flashing, my toxic family fell apart. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, walking briskly up the path. I calmly met them at the bottom of the stairs, handing over my identification and the freshly signed deed transfer documents. The older officer reviewed the paperwork carefully, his expression stern. He then looked up at Graham, Delia, and Veda, who were huddled together on the porch, looking guilty and terrified. Sir, the officer said, his voice carrying undeniable authority. This documentation establishes the lady as the sole legal owner of the property. She has requested that you leave the premises. If you do not comply, you will be removed and charged with criminal trespassing. We live here, Veda shrieked, her carefully cultivated professional demeanor shattered. You cannot just throw us out on the street. We have rights? Actually, ma'am, you do not, the officer replied calmly. You are not on the deed, and the owner is within her rights to demand you leave the immediate property today. I suggest you get to your vehicle. Graham's face was a mask of pure fury. He grabbed Delia by the arm, dragging her roughly down the porch steps. Veda followed closely behind, her expensive heels clicking angrily against the concrete. I stood tall, holding my daughter's hand, watching them retreat in disgrace. They scrambled into Graham's luxury sedan parked at the edge of the driveway. Before speeding away, Veda slammed her hand against the dashboard and rolled down the window. You think you won, she screamed, her voice echoing violently down the quiet street. You just started a war you cannot afford to fight, Marin. I am going to make you regret this. I will make sure you have nothing left. I watched the taillights of their car disappear around the corner. I unlocked the front door and led my children inside, locking the deadbolt firmly behind me. I had won the battle for my home, but as the silence of the empty house settled around me, I knew Veda was right about one thing. The war had just begun. And the very next morning, she delivered a strike so devastating I almost did not survive it. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my kitchen, casting long shadows across the floorboards. For a fleeting second before my brain fully engaged, I felt a sense of normal suburban peace. Then the memories of yesterday afternoon came crashing back with the force of a physical blow. The eviction papers on the porch, the revelation of my father's secret limited liability company, the police escorting my own family off the property. The house was mine now, but the silence inside it felt heavy and oppressive. I dragged myself out of bed, checking on Leo and Maya. They were still asleep in their shared room, their small chests rising and falling in steady rhythms. I needed to get up, put on a brave face, and pretend the world had not shifted on its axis. We had absolutely nothing in the refrigerator. In their haste to kick me out, my parents had apparently cleared out the pantry, likely taking the food to whatever hotel they had retreated to. I needed to buy groceries to create a sense of stability for my kids. We arrived at the local supermarket just past 9. I kept a tight grip on Maya's hand while Leo walked ahead, eagerly pointing out his favorite brands of cereal. I filled the cart with comforting staples, fresh fruit, milk, bread, and the expensive organic macaroni and cheese they loved. I wanted them to know that even though their grandmother and aunt were gone, their mother would always provide for them. We reached the checkout lane, and I began unloading the items onto the black conveyor belt. The cashier, a friendly teenage girl, smiled as she scanned our groceries. Your total comes to $142, the cashier announced pleasantly. I reached into my purse and pulled out my primary debit card. It was tied to a joint savings and checking account I had foolishly kept linked with my mother, Delia, since I was in college. It was the account where I kept my emergency medical fund for the kids and where I had just deposited a massive $65,000 payment from a major architectural client 3 days ago. I inserted the chip into the card reader distractedly. The machine beeped a harsh, discordant tone. A bold red message flashed across the digital screen stating the transaction was declined. I frowned, pulling the card out and wiping the chip on my jeans. "Let me try that again," I said to the cashier, forcing a light laugh. Sometimes this chip is a little temperamental. I inserted the card a second time, holding my breath. The machine beeped again. Declined. A flush of heat crept up my neck. The people standing in line behind me shifted impatiently. "I am so sorry," I mumbled, rummaging through my wallet for my backup credit card. I handed it to the cashier to swipe manually. She swiped it once, twice, and then looked at me with a sympathetic wince. "I am sorry, ma'am, but this one is declining, too," she said softly. Panic began to flutter in my chest like a trapped bird. This made no sense. I had over $65,000 in that primary account. "Mommy, why can we not buy our food?" Maya asked, tugging on the hem of my sweater. Her large eyes were wide with innocent confusion. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to cry. "Let me check my banking app," I told the cashier, stepping slightly to the side to let the next customer pass. My fingers trembled as I opened the application on my phone. The screen loaded slowly, the little blue circles spinning endlessly. When the account balances finally appeared, my heart plummeted directly into my stomach. The checking account balance read $0. I quickly toggled to the shared savings account. $0. The emergency medical fund for Leo and Maya had been completely drained. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on the recent transaction history. At exactly 11:45 last night, hours after they were escorted off my porch, someone had executed a series of massive wire transfers. Every single dollar I possessed had been moved to a new external account. I stared at the routing information attached to the massive transfers. The destination was not a standard domestic bank. The funds had been wired to a corporate holding account registered under the name Veda Tech Properties. Veda and my mother had not just made an empty threat when they screamed from the car window. They had systematically stripped me of every single cent of liquid cash I had to my name. They knew my massive inheritance from my father consisted of real estate and a blind holding company, not immediately accessible funds. The legal process of transferring corporate trust money into a personal checking account would take days, maybe a week. In the meantime, they intentionally left me standing in a grocery store with 2 hungry children and no way to buy them food. They wanted to break me. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with angry tears. I pulled up my mother's contact number and hit dial. She answered on the second ring, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Hello, Marin," Delia answered smoothly. "I assume you are calling to apologize for your dramatic stunt yesterday." "You stole my money," I whispered fiercely, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. "You drained $65,000 from the joint account. That was my money from my drafting clients. That was the medical fund for your own grandchildren." "I did not steal anything," Delia replied, her tone turning cold and defensive. "Your name and my name are both on that account. Legally, I have every right to transfer those funds. Vada's company is facing a critical payroll shortage this week. She is on the verge of securing a massive Series B funding round, and if her software engineers quit today, she loses everything. We had to move the money to her corporate account to save her business." "You stole from my children to pay Vada's employees," I demanded, my voice rising in disbelief. "You need to learn how to sacrifice for this family, Marin," my mother scolded, adopting her familiar tone of disappointment. "Veda is doing important work. She is building a legacy. You just inherited a fortune from that deadbeat father of yours, so you do not need that cash right now anyway. Consider it repayment for all the years Graham and I let you live in that house." She hung up the phone. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a mocking soundtrack to my total financial devastation. I looked down at Leo and Maya, who were watching me with growing concern. I forced the brightest, most convincing smile I could manage. It looks like the bank is having a silly computer glitch today. Guys, I said brightly, masking the pure terror in my heart. We will have to come back later. I apologized to the cashier, abandoning a cart full of carefully selected groceries, and led my children out of the store. The walk to the car felt like marching through thick mud. I buckled them into their car seats, promising we would stop at a drive-thru for breakfast using the emergency $20 bill I kept hidden in the glove compartment. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, I realized the true depth of their cruelty. They thought because I was the quiet, invisible daughter, I would just accept this theft. They thought they could starve me out. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone vibrated with a notification that proved stealing my money was only the first phase of Vada's attack. The second phase was designed to make sure I could never earn a single dollar again. The drive back to the house was agonizingly quiet. I fed the kids cheap fast food breakfast sandwiches, my mind racing with terrifying calculations. I had no liquid cash. My credit cards were maxed out from recent legal fees in Boston. I needed my work. My freelance architectural drafting business was my only immediate lifeline. It was a career I had painstakingly built during late nights after the kids went to sleep, cultivating a small but loyal roster of high-paying architectural firms. I walked into my home office, instructing Leo and Maya to watch a cartoon in the living room. The morning sunlight poured through the window, illuminating my dual-monitor setup. I took a deep breath and opened my laptop. My priority was to contact a new client who was expecting a preliminary 3D rendering this morning. If I delivered it early, I could request an expedited invoice payment to buy groceries tomorrow. I navigated to my secure cloud server, where I hosted all my heavy rendering files and client portfolios. The screen loaded, but instead of my organized directories, I was greeted by a glaring white screen. A standard error message sat in the top corner stating the server directory could not be found. I frowned, clicking the refresh button. Nothing happened. My heart gave an irregular flutter. Server glitches happen. But the timing felt deeply unsettling. I immediately logged into my hosting provider's backend to check the server status. My password was rejected. I typed it again, slower this time. Rejected again. A cold sweat began to prickle along my hairline. I clicked the password recovery link, waiting for the automated email. 10 minutes passed. My inbox remained completely empty. The creeping dread expanded into full-blown panic. I opened a command terminal and ran a diagnostic trace on my server IP. The results made the blood drain from my face. My primary administrative access had been revoked in the middle of the night. The digital footprint was masked, routed through proxy servers, but the outcome was undeniable. The server had been wiped clean. Nearly a decade of my creative work, my custom rendering assets, and my current active client files had been entirely deleted from the internet. I sat frozen in my office chair. The hum of my computer fan sounded incredibly loud in the quiet house. Who could have done this? The answer arrived instantly. Veda. Her startup was a prop tech company. She was surrounded by brilliant software engineers and hackers who built secure database architectures for a living. She had the skills, the connections, and the malicious intent to dismantle my digital life. As I stared blankly at the error screen, a small pinging sound broke the silence. A new email had arrived in my professional inbox. I clicked over to it, my hands shaking. It was from Marcus Thorne, the senior partner at a prestigious commercial architecture firm and my most lucrative ongoing client. His subject line read simply, "Regarding your unhinged email." I furrowed my brow. I had not sent Marcus an email in over a week. I opened the message and read his response. "Marin, I am deeply disturbed by the message you sent my team earlier this morning. The tone and content of your email were highly unprofessional and, frankly, alarming. Given your stated inability to meet our deadlines due to what you described as a severe psychological breakdown and the bizarre insults you directed at our firm, we will be terminating our freelance contract effective immediately. We wish you the best in seeking professional help." I stopped breathing. The words blurred together on the glowing screen. Psychological breakdown. Unprofessional. I frantically scrolled down to look at the email thread history, reading the original message Marcus was replying to. It had been sent from an email address that looked almost exactly like mine, with just one letter transposed. The message was a frantic, rambling manifesto. It claimed I was suffering from a severe mental health crisis, abandoning all my current projects, and included vicious, targeted insults directed at the architecture firm's recent designs. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. I quickly checked my sent folder and client contact lists. Another email arrived, this one from a boutique residential builder I had been consulting for. His message was shorter, but equally devastating, canceling our upcoming strategy meeting and severing our working relationship due to my erratic and hostile communication. Veda had not just stolen my money and attempted to steal my house. She was actively destroying my professional reputation. She was systematically burning my bridges, ensuring that my primary source of independent income was entirely eradicated. She had used her tech connections to hack into my server, delete my assets, and spoof my identity to spread vicious rumors about my mental stability. She was creating a digital paper trail that made me look like an erratic woman falling apart at the seams. It was professional sabotage of the highest order. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up, my legs feeling weak and unreliable. The walls of my small office seemed to be closing in on me. The isolation was terrifying. I had no money in my checking account. My mother had justified stealing my savings. My sister had burned my career to the ground. I walked out of the office and down the hallway, listening to the soft sounds of Leo and Maya playing in the living room. They were innocent in all of this. I leaned against the hallway wall, sliding down until I hit the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. This was rock bottom. The darkness threatened to swallow me whole. I felt the urge to curl up and surrender, to call my mother and beg her to give me back just enough money to feed my kids, to agree to whatever terrible terms Veda wanted just to make the relentless attacks end. They wanted me desperate. They wanted me crawling back to them. I sat on the floor for a long time, letting the tears fall down my cheeks. I mourned the loss of my portfolio, the betrayal of my clients, and the sheer cruelty of the people who were supposed to be my family. But as the tears dried, the despair began to harden into something else entirely. It was a cold, sharp feeling that radiated outward from my chest. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought, because I lacked their specific coding skills and their ruthless corporate mentality, I was defenseless. They had fundamentally underestimated me. They were attacking a woman they believed was financially dependent and socially isolated. I wiped my face, stood up, and walked back into my office. I refused to surrender to Veda and Delia. I picked up my mobile phone, ready to unleash the hidden power I possessed. I dialed a number in Boston. Holden answered on the first ring, his deep voice calm and authoritative. "Hello, Marin. I assume the suburban dust has settled?" They stole $65,000 from my accounts, wiped my professional servers, and spoofed my email to destroy my career, I stated, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I need access to the emergency trust liquidity, and I need you to fly to Chicago immediately. We are going to war." Holden paused for a fraction of a second. "I will be on the next flight," he replied. "They think they are playing a game of chess, Marin. But they do not realize you just flipped the entire board." Holden arrived in Chicago late the next morning. He was a man in his mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, possessing piercing gray eyes and a demeanor that lacked any artificial warmth. He was the senior managing partner of the law firm that had handled my biological father's estate for decades. My father had trusted him implicitly, and after seeing how efficiently Holden had processed my inheritance paperwork in Boston, I knew he was exactly the kind of shark I needed. I met him in the private conference room of a high-end hotel downtown, having left Leo and Maya safely with a trusted neighborhood friend. I had used a small emergency wire transfer Holden facilitated from a secondary trust account to pay for the childcare and finally buy groceries. Holden sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, his briefcase open, meticulously reviewing the printed documents I had brought him. I did not waste his precious time with tears or emotional storytelling. I explained the situation with clinical precision. I detailed how my mother had drained the joint savings account, providing him with the bank routing number showing the transfer to Veda Tech Properties. I handed him the fraudulent emails Veda had spoofed to my architectural clients, along with the diagnostic trace proving my server had been maliciously wiped by an external IP address. Holden listened in silence. His expression remained neutral as his sharp eyes quickly scanned the banking records and the timestamps on the fraudulent emails. When he finally looked up at me, there was a cold, calculating gleam in his eyes. Your mother and your sister have made a series of critical, highly actionable legal errors, Holden said, his voice a low baritone that commanded instant authority. They assumed you lack the financial resources to mount a serious offensive defense against their coordinated attacks. They were relying on intimidation to force you into submission. He paused, tapping his expensive fountain pen thoughtfully against the edge of my father's extensive trust portfolio. However, this inheritance changes the entire landscape of your situation. You are no longer a financially dependent daughter fighting over suburban equity. You are the sole beneficiary of an incredibly substantial estate. But before we draft the emergency injunctions to freeze Vada's corporate accounts and file the criminal harassment charges against her, I need you to understand exactly what you possess. Holden reached across the table and deliberately slid a thick, heavy black dossier directly toward me. It stopped just a few inches away from my hands. We have completed the full asset trace on your inheritance, he explained smoothly. The liquid trust containing the $40 million is merely a fraction of the overall estate portfolio. Your father was far more successful than even I initially realized. I stared at him, feeling my pulse quicken. What else is there? I asked. Holden opened the heavy cover of the black dossier, revealing a glossy aerial photograph of an enormous building. Arthur Vance fully owned a towering commercial skyscraper right in the middle of downtown Boston, he stated. But that is not even the most interesting part of this discovery. I flipped to the second page, scanning down a detailed corporate tenant list. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The letters seemed to jump off the heavy paper, burning themselves directly into my retinas. Veda Tech Properties. I stared at the name, my pulse suddenly roaring in my ears. I traced my trembling index finger across the glossy page, reading the detailed corporate profile, the massive security deposit figures, and the explicit operational covenants. It was undeniably them. My arrogant sister, the golden child who had just called me a peasant and tried to evict me from my own home, was renting her brand new luxury corporate headquarters directly inside the massive Boston skyscraper that I now legally owned. The silence in the conference room stretched on for a long moment as my brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of this cosmic irony. Veda and my parents had spent the last 2 years pouring every dollar they could secure into her prop tech startup, constantly boasting about their prestigious new address in Boston. They had signed a 10-year commercial lease in a gleaming glass and steel skyscraper, believing it cemented their status as elite tech founders. They had no idea that the anonymous corporate entity they were paying tens of thousands of dollars to every single month was a holding company entirely controlled by my late father. And now, that massive holding company belonged exclusively to me. I looked across the polished table at Holden, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. Holden mirrored my expression perfectly, his sharp gray eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. She signed an ironclad commercial lease agreement with your father's holding company, Holden explained, detailing the massive security deposit and the strict clauses my father's lawyers had deliberately drafted. Veda locked her entire company into a rigid contract with a landlord she does not know. A landlord who now has the power to scrutinize her business operations, audit her financial stability, and enforce every single penalty clause to the letter. I realized in that exact moment that this was no longer just a messy family dispute over a suburban house and stolen savings. This was an unprecedented opportunity for systematic destruction. Veda had maliciously stripped me of my financial security, hidden my money in her corporate accounts, and professionally sabotaged my drafting career. She had deeply underestimated me, assuming I lacked the intellect and the resources to effectively fight back. But sitting in that conference room, looking at the undeniable proof of my overwhelming leverage, I knew my next steps were entirely clear. "Holden," I said, my voice radiating icy authority. "I want a comprehensive forensic audit initiated immediately on every single financial transaction related to the Vedatech Properties commercial lease. I want to know exactly how much rent she owes us, and I want to know exactly what she is doing with the $65,000 she stole from my children." Holden nodded sharply, quickly jotting down my orders on his legal pad. "We will analyze their monthly rent payments and thoroughly investigate the financial origins of their corporate funding." I stood up carefully, smoothing the lines of my jacket, feeling the immense power of my father's legacy coursing through my veins. "Prepare the paperwork, Holden. We are going to Boston. It is time to let my sister know exactly who holds the keys to her castle. If you want to know how I crashed my sister's $1 million investor gala and exposed her massive financial fraud to the world, stick around for the next part." Thank you for watching so far. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you love seeing arrogant, toxic family members get exactly what they deserve. Leave a comment below if you have ever had a sibling try to steal your success. The flight to Boston felt entirely different from my panicked journey just a few days prior. I was no longer a terrified widow scrambling to understand a complex legal will. As the commercial plane soared high above the clouds, I felt a profound internal shift taking place. The insecure, blindly compliant daughter who had quietly sacrificed her own career growth to fully fund her sister's arrogant tech ambitions was permanently gone. I had transformed myself from someone whose value was determined by toxic family expectations into a woman who defined her own worth. A sleek black town car was already waiting for me at the arrival's curb when I landed. Flawlessly arranged in advance by Holden's incredibly efficient office, the silent driver smoothly navigated the chaotic morning traffic of downtown Boston. My heart pounded a steady, undeniable rhythm against my ribs as we pulled up directly to the curb of an imposing, breathtaking modern structure that scraped the gray sky. The massive building was an architectural marvel, featuring a flawless exterior glass facade. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle, carefully smoothing the crisp lines of my tailored coat. I stood completely still on the crowded sidewalk for a long moment, quietly taking in the sheer scale of the incredible asset I now commanded. It was not just a valuable piece of commercial real estate. It was an impenetrable fortress of power. Holden had coordinated my arrival with the building's executive property manager, a professional man named Richard, who was anxiously waiting for me in the grand lobby. Richard quickly guided me past the standard security checkpoints, bypassing the normal visitor protocols entirely. We rode the private VIP elevator up to the penthouse boardroom. When the polished steel doors opened, I stepped into a spectacular room featuring huge panoramic windows overlooking the sprawling city below. My new management team stood respectfully around a massive mahogany table. I took my rightful seat firmly at the head. "Miss Vance," Richard began, his voice projecting clear authority across the spacious room. "We have prepared comprehensive dossiers detailing every single operational aspect of this property, specifically focusing on the commercial lease agreements for floors 40, 41, and 42. The suites currently occupied by Vedatech Properties." He slid a heavy, meticulously organized binder across the polished wood toward me. I opened the cover, staring at the sheer volume of financial data neatly printed on the crisp white pages. I spent the next hour meticulously reviewing the extensive operational reports with Richard and Holden. As we reached the section detailing Vodah's rental history, Richard paused and carefully adjusted his reading glasses. The initial review of their commercial lease revealed a staggering monthly rental rate perfectly aligned with the luxury status of the 3 floors they occupied. But as we traced the payment schedule over the past year, a massive irregularity emerged. Vedatech Properties had successfully paid their security deposit and their first 3 months of commercial rent. However, right after that brief honeymoon period, the automated transfers had abruptly stopped. I traced my index finger down the final column of the ledger, my heart pounding a steady rhythm of disbelief. "Richard," I said, pointing directly to the empty blank spaces on the financial report. "Am I reading this correctly today?" Has my sister's company failed to submit a single rent payment for the past 6 entire months? Richard slowly took off his glasses, his facial expression hardening into disdain. You are reading it correctly, ma'am. They are currently 6 months in arrears. They owe this holding company over $400,000 in back rent and accumulating late penalties. They have been receiving default notices from our billing system every single week, but they keep requesting extensions by claiming they are finalizing a new round of venture capital funding. I looked at Holden. He was typing furiously on his laptop, cross-referencing the building ledgers with the personal banking records we had obtained from my drained joint accounts in Chicago. This makes no sense, I told them, pacing behind my heavy leather chair. Veda and my parents have been flying first class, wearing designer clothes, and acting like billionaires. If she has not paid rent in half a year, where did all her seed money go? Holden stopped typing and looked directly at me, his gray eyes narrowing with calculated focus. It went to a failed product launch, Marin. I am looking at her corporate filings. Veda Tech Properties burned through their initial funding round developing a software architecture full of critical bugs. They're insolvent. They have been running on fumes and empty promises for months. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Veda was not a brilliant tech innovator. She was a massive fraud living a total lie. But what about the $65,000 she stole from my shared savings account the night she tried to kick me out of my house? I asked, my voice tight with anger. Why would she risk grand theft for $65,000 when her failing company owes $400,000 in overdue rent? Holden smiled a terrifying smile. Because $65,000 was the exact amount she needed to cover her emergency company payroll this week. She did not steal your money to pay the rent, Marin. She stole your money to pay her software engineers just long enough to keep them from quitting before her next investor meeting. If her coding staff walked out today, her investors would realize the company was failing. She stole your children's medical fund to artificially inflate her balance sheet and hide her insolvency. The sheer audacity of her reckless actions left the boardroom in total silence. My sister had thrown me and our 2 children away like garbage, labeling me a useless peasant, while simultaneously stealing the money I had diligently earned to keep her fraudulent tech company breathing for a few more days. My mother had justified stealing from her own grandchildren to protect this magnificent lie. I pulled out my cell phone, feeling a sudden urge to see exactly what kind of delusion they were currently projecting to the outside world. I opened a social media application and navigated directly to Vada's public professional profile. The first thing I saw was a freshly uploaded promotional livestream. Veda was standing confidently in the grand atrium of her Boston office, wearing a custom-tailored crimson suit. My mother, Delia, stood right beside her shoulder, flashing a victorious smile at the camera. We have incredible news for the entire tech world today, Veda proudly announced in the video, her arrogant tone making my skin crawl. Veda Tech Properties is officially launching our highly anticipated Series B funding round. We are hosting a massive, exclusive investor gala next Friday night right here at our luxury corporate headquarters in downtown Boston. We are ready to revolutionize the real estate industry and quickly secure our next $50 million. I stared silently at the glowing screen, my blood running ice cold. They were completely bankrupt, surviving daily on stolen money and facing imminent legal eviction. Yet they were actively planning to throw a massive gala inside my own building to scam new investors into funding their failed venture. They genuinely thought they had successfully ruined my life and permanently secured their own glorious future. I placed my phone onto the polished mahogany table. The heartbroken woman who had wept on her hallway floor in Chicago was gone. In her place stood the sole owner of a commercial real estate empire, fully armed with the exact documentation required to execute total destruction. Richard, I said, my voice radiating icy authority. I want you to draw up the commercial lockout documents today. Terminate their lease for non-payment and initiate the immediate legal seizure of all their physical corporate assets located on floors 40, 41, and 42. Richard nodded sharply. Yes, ma'am. We can have the glass doors padlocked and our best security guards posted by tomorrow morning. No, I corrected him softly, a dangerous smile spreading across my face. Do not lock their doors tomorrow. Let them set up their expensive caterers, their massive champagne towers, and their custom event lighting. Let them invite the absolute wealthiest venture capitalists directly into the building next Friday. We are going to attend that gala. The days leading up to the gala were a blur of calculated execution. I stayed in the penthouse, watching the preparations unfold on the security monitors. I watched Veda and my parents arrive early each morning, shouting orders at the lighting technicians and stressing over expensive floral arrangements. They were exhausted, running on the sheer adrenaline of their massive deception. They truly believed that if they could just secure this new round of venture capital funding, all their financial crimes and stolen money would simply be erased. They had absolutely no clue that the landlord they were currently avoiding was sitting exactly 10 floors above them, watching their every move. During the week, I reviewed the extensive dossier Holden had compiled regarding the upcoming event. Veda had spared no expense. She had hired Prestige Events, the most exclusive catering company in the city, known for servicing celebrity functions. She had ordered a dozen private security guards to ensure only the wealthiest venture capitalists gained entry. She was throwing the party of the decade to save her insolvent startup, unaware that she was hosting it inside a financial fortress that belonged entirely to me. I did not just want to disrupt her party. I wanted absolute control over every aspect of the room. Because my holding company managed the service elevators, Veda had been forced to submit detailed lists of every caterer, bartender, and staff member scheduled to work the gala. I told Richard to contact Julian, the owner of the catering company, and request an immediate meeting in the penthouse. Less than an hour later, Julian arrived, looking incredibly nervous about being summoned by the anonymous corporate landlord of the building. I introduced myself as the primary owner and invited him to sit. I placed a certified bank draft on the table face down. I explained that I was acquiring his contract for the Veda Tech Properties Gala. Julian immediately protested, citing his reputation and his binding agreement with Veda. I let him speak, nodding politely, and then I flipped the bank draft over. It was made out for triple his expected profit margin for the entire quarter. I told him he could keep the original deposit Veda had paid, take this massive bonus, and give his regular staff a paid vacation for the week. In exchange, I required him to transfer the catering contract to my own management team. Julian stared at the astronomical figure, swallowed hard, and signed the transfer documents without another word. With the catering company bought out, I had the perfect Trojan horse. Over the next 48 hours, I brought in my own trusted personnel. I hired a team of forensic corporate auditors, off-duty law enforcement officers, and private investigators, outfitting them in the crisp black and white uniforms required for the event staff. The men and women pouring the champagne and passing the warm appetizers would actually be my own operatives, documenting every conversation and securing the perimeter from the inside out. Veda was paying for a luxury service, but she was funding her own surveillance team. My next focus was the building security infrastructure. Richard and I sat in the master control room in the sub-basement, watching the grid of surveillance monitors. Veda had hired private guards for the entrance, but my building management system controlled the electronic locks, the elevator banks, and the power grids. I instructed the chief security officer to revoke Veda's administrative access. We reprogrammed the security protocols so that my team had absolute override authority. I ensured that once Veda and my parents stepped onto that floor, they would not be able to leave, hide, or control the environment in any way. They were walking blindly into a cage, and I held the only key. The night of the gala finally arrived. The city outside was a dazzling ocean of lights, but the real show was taking place on the 40th floor. I stood in the penthouse control room, watching the high-definition security feed as the wealthiest investors in Boston began pouring out of the elevators. The grand atrium of Veda Tech Properties had been transformed into a spectacular venue. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the skyline, while custom amber lighting bathed the room in a warm, expensive glow. Waiters in crisp uniforms seamlessly navigated the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar and crystal flutes of premium champagne. It was a masterpiece of corporate illusion. Veda and my mother were in their absolute element. Veda wore a stunning backless scarlet couture gown, her hair swept up in an elegant style, dripping in expensive borrowed jewelry. Delia wore a dark emerald dress, walking arm in arm with Graham, projecting the perfect image of a wealthy, successful family. They moved gracefully through the room, shaking hands with billionaires, laughing at jokes, and effortlessly selling the fake dream of their technology empire. They looked unstoppable. They looked like they had successfully conquered the world and buried me in the process. I watched closely as Veda checked her expensive watch and nodded smoothly to her mother. It was time for the main event. The ambient music slowly faded down, and a soft spotlight illuminated a sleek acrylic podium positioned directly in the center of the massive room. The wealthy investors gathered around, murmuring with eager anticipation as Veda stepped up to the microphone, raising her crystal champagne glass high into the air. She was preparing to deliver the pitch of her life, ready to ask for $50 million. I turned away from the security monitor and walked toward my private executive elevator. It was time. I was wearing a sharp, flawless emerald green designer suit, my shoulders pulled back, my head held incredibly high. I pressed the heavy silver button for the 40th floor. The quiet hum of the elevator descending felt like the ticking of a bomb about to detonate. For 34 years, I had deliberately minimized my own existence, wearing faded, oversized sweaters and practical denim jeans, shrinking into the background so my sister could stand in the spotlight. I had spent countless exhausted evenings managing domestic chores and quietly enduring my mother's passive-aggressive insults so Veda could cultivate her arrogant founder persona. That subservient, blindly compliant peasant was permanently gone, replaced entirely by a formidable corporate titan who legally owned the very concrete and steel beneath their expensive shoes. The private elevator doors slid apart with a soft metallic whisper, granting me unrestricted access to the spectacular grand atrium. I stepped out of the polished steel car, and my crisp emerald green suit immediately caught the ambient amber lighting of the massive room. The luxurious fabric draped perfectly across my shoulders, serving as a physical manifestation of the undeniable power I now quietly held. The sprawling room was a dazzling sea of bespoke charcoal tuxedos and sparkling couture evening gowns, filled to capacity with the wealthiest venture capitalists in the city. They stood in small, powerful clusters, their eager faces turned toward the center of the room. They were completely unaware that the lavish corporate event they were attending was built entirely on a crumbling foundation of stolen funds and staggering fraud. As I began a slow, deliberate walk across the plush custom carpeting, the atmosphere in the room seemed to physically shift around me. People instinctively stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea, subconsciously sensing the raw, untouchable authority radiating from my every movement. I did not rush my approach. I took my time, allowing my sharp gaze to sweep over the magnificent custom lighting installations and the towering floral arrangements my family had desperately purchased to project a false illusion of financial solvency. Moving seamlessly through the wealthy crowd were the catering staff and bartenders I had personally installed. Dressed in flawless black and white uniforms, my team of corporate auditors and private investigators expertly passed warm appetizers while carefully monitoring the room. As I walked past a tall tray-carrying waiter, he offered a nearly imperceptible nod of his head, confirming that the perimeter was entirely secure and my trap was flawlessly set. Veda stood at the sleek acrylic podium in the exact center of the room, tapping her crystal glass a second time to command the absolute attention of her billionaire audience. Delia and Graham stood a half step behind her right shoulder, their faces radiating pure, unadulterated triumph. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," Veda began, her voice echoing across the massive space through the state-of-the-art sound system. Veda Tech Properties is standing on the precipice of a global real estate revolution, and we are thrilled to invite you to be part of our historic journey. I continued walking forward, my emerald green suit cutting a sharp, distinct line through the sea of dark formal wear. I was roughly 30 feet away from the podium when Veda casually shifted her gaze across the front row of potential investors. Her eyes swept over a group of older men in tailored suits, moved past a prominent tech blogger, and then locked directly onto my face. The transformation was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying to witness. The arrogant, charming smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by a mask of absolute shock and creeping terror. Her voice faltered mid-sentence, the confident pitch of her ambitious speech dying abruptly in her throat. She blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to comprehend how the discarded, financially destitute sister she had left crying in a Chicago suburb was currently standing inside her highly exclusive, heavily guarded Boston investor gala. Delia noticed her sudden hesitation and leaned forward, following Voda's frozen gaze. When my mother saw me, she physically recoiled, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in sheer disbelief. Veda quickly covered the microphone with her hand, muttering a hasty excuse to the confused crowd about a minor technical difficulty. She abandoned the acrylic podium instantly, marching aggressively through the crowd directly toward me. Delia followed closely behind, her face flushed dark red with suppressed fury. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Veda hissed, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper as she stopped mere inches from my face. "How did you even get past the lobby security desk? You need to leave this building right this second before I have you arrested for trespassing." I looked up at her, my expression entirely unbothered by her aggressive posturing. "I am not going anywhere, Veda," I replied softly, ensuring my voice remained perfectly calm and steady. "I am simply attending a corporate event in my own building." "You do not belong here," she sneered, her eyes starting nervously toward the wealthy investors who were beginning to murmur amongst themselves. "You are nothing but a jealous, pathetic loser who cannot accept that I am better than you. You are trying to ruin the most important night of my professional career. Now turn around and walk out those doors before I publicly humiliate you." When I simply offered her a cold, knowing smile, my mother completely lost her temper. Delia stepped forward, raising her hand high into the air, fully intending to slap me across the face in front of the entire room. "You ungrateful little peasant," Delia snarled. But her hand never made contact with my cheek. Before Delia could strike me, 2 large security guards, the former police officers I had personally vetted and hired, stepped smoothly forward. The taller guard caught Delia's wrist mid-air with a firm, unbreakable grip. "Let go of me," Delia shrieked, struggling against the guard's hold. Veda spun around and aggressively snapped her fingers at the security personnel. "Hey," Veda barked, her voice carrying a harsh tone of absolute command. "This woman is an uninvited trespasser. She is harassing my guests. Grab her arms and physically throw her out of my building right now. I do not care if you have to drag her through the lobby. Just get her out of my sight." The security guards did not reach for my arms. They did not attempt to physically restrain me in any capacity. Instead, they released Delia's wrist and smoothly pivoted to face Veda. They stood at perfect attention, effectively forming a protective human wall between me and my furious family. Veda dropped her arms, her mouth falling slightly open as her brain struggled to process the blatant insubordination. "What is wrong with you two?" she yelled, panic beginning to override her anger. "I am the founder of this company. I am paying your exorbitant hourly rates. I gave you a direct order to remove this crazy woman from my corporate event immediately." The taller guard looked at Veda with absolute professional indifference. "I apologize for the confusion, ma'am," the guard stated in a loud, clear voice that carried easily to the front row of bewildered investors. "But we do not take our operational orders from commercial tenants facing eviction. We take our direct orders exclusively from the legal owner of this building. And Miss Vance has not instructed us to leave." Veda stumbled backward a half-step, the blood draining entirely from her face. She looked frantically from the stoic security guards to me, her mind desperately trying to connect the impossible dots I had just laid out before her. Commercial tenant. Legal owner. I did not give her the time to solve the puzzle. I stepped smoothly forward, and the guards instantly parted ways for me, creating a clear, unobstructed path directly to the center of the room. I walked straight past a stammering, completely paralyzed Veda and my horrified mother, leaving them stranded in the middle of the crowd. I ascended the 3 small stairs leading to the main stage and confidently stepped behind the acrylic podium. I casually adjusted the height of the slender silver microphone. I looked out over the massive crowd of venture capitalists, tech journalists, and elite investors. The room had fallen into a state of absolute, pin-drop silence. Every single eye was locked directly on me, waiting to see what the woman in the emerald green suit was going to do next. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting with crystal-clear authority across the entire 40th floor. "My name is Maren Vance. I am the sole owner of Oakwood Holdings, the limited liability company that fully owns and manages this magnificent commercial skyscraper. I want to formally welcome you all to my building tonight." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled rapidly through the wealthy crowd. High-powered executives exchanged deeply confused glances, clearly wondering why the billionaire landlord of the property was abruptly interrupting a Series B funding pitch. I offered the crowd a warm, professional smile before allowing my tone to shift into something significantly sharper. "I understand you were all invited here tonight by Veda and her executive team at Veda Tech Properties to discuss potential massive financial investments," I continued, pacing my words with calculated precision. "However, as the primary landlord and the legal overseer of this specific commercial lease, I felt a strong moral and ethical obligation to provide you with some highly relevant financial context before any of you commit a single dollar of your respective portfolios to this insolvent venture." Veda finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged toward the stage, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Maren, shut your mouth right now," she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Do not listen to her. She is my bitter, jealous sister. She is having a mental breakdown. Turn off her microphone immediately." My security guards instantly stepped forward, physically blocking Veda and my parents from reaching the stairs, forcing them to remain trapped on the floor with the investors they were attempting to defraud. I ignored her pathetic shouting entirely and turned my attention back to the crowd. Veda Tech Properties is currently 6 months in arrears on their commercial rent for these 3 luxury floors, I announced clearly, watching the venture capitalists physically recoil at the revelation. They owe Oakwood Holdings over $400,000 in overdue payments and accumulating late penalties. The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and angry whispers. Billionaire investors who had been moments away from writing massive checks began furiously whispering to their legal aides and angrily setting their champagne glasses down on the passing trays. I raised my right hand slightly, offering a subtle signal to my dedicated audiovisual team stationed in the control booth at the back of the room. Instantly, the massive high-definition presentation screens towering behind the sleek acrylic podium flickered to life. The screens had been carefully prepped to display Vada's ambitious financial projections and pitch deck, but my team seamlessly intercepted the feed. A collective gasp rippled through the wealthy crowd as a high-resolution image of a formal commercial eviction notice materialized across the massive displays, projecting Vada's absolute failure in towering, undeniable letters for every single investor to read clearly. "What you are currently looking at is a legally binding 30-day notice to vacate, citing severe breach of contract," I stated, gesturing gracefully toward the enormous screens. For the past 6 entire months, Veda and her executive team have completely failed to submit a single rent payment for this luxury corporate headquarters. They invited you to this exclusive gala tonight hoping to secure your investment capital simply to pay off their angry landlord and cover their massive debts. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into loud, agitated whispers. Several prominent venture capitalists immediately pulled out their cell phones, furiously typing messages to their respective legal teams. Veda spun around to look at the massive screens, her eyes wide with genuine terror. "Maren, stop this right now," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she realized the walls were closing in. "You cannot share private commercial lease agreements in a public forum." I looked down at her, my expression radiating cold indifference. There is absolutely nothing illegal about a property owner informing the public about an active commercial eviction, Veda. However, we should definitely discuss what actually constitutes illegal behavior. I offered another subtle nod to the control booth. The massive screens behind me instantly shifted, replacing the eviction notice with a series of highly detailed, meticulously highlighted financial ledgers and bank transfer records. The new documents displayed a crystal-clear, undeniable paper trail. The crowd leaned in, their trained financial eyes quickly analyzing the damning data. These records represent the complete financial insolvency of VedaTech Properties, I announced, projecting my voice clearly over the growing commotion. As you can clearly see on the screens, this company completely exhausted its initial venture capital funding months ago due to catastrophic product development failures. They have been operating on empty bank accounts. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. But the most disturbing aspect of their financial desperation is how they chose to cover their payroll obligations this week. 4 days ago, I continued, my voice echoing with icy precision, Veda and my mother, Delia, executed a series of unauthorized wire transfers in the middle of the night. They illegally drained $65,000 from my personal joint savings accounts in Illinois. They systematically stripped a widowed mother of her entire emergency medical fund for her 2 young children and secretly funneled the stolen money directly into the VedaTech Properties corporate accounts. A senior partner from a major venture capital firm crossed his arms, glaring firmly directly at Veda and Delia. They did this specifically to pay their software engineers just long enough to prevent them from quitting before this gala, I declared. They embezzled a widow's savings to artificially inflate their balance sheets and completely defraud every single person standing in this room tonight. Delia let out a loud, dramatic sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. The dark emerald dress she wore suddenly looked entirely foolish against the backdrop of her monumental public disgrace. Veda frantically shook her head, waving her hands wildly at the furious investors surrounding her. It is a lie, she shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. She is a vindictive liar trying to ruin my life because she is jealous. The money was a mutual family investment. We are on the verge of a massive software breakthrough. Please, you have to listen to me. Before anyone could respond to her pathetic pleading, the heavy glass doors at the back of the atrium swung wide open. Holden's private process servers, dressed sharply in dark suits, walked briskly into the room, flanked by 3 armed building security officers. They marched directly through the parting crowd, ignoring the chaos, and stopped right in front of Veda and my parents. One of the servers thrust a thick, heavy stack of legal documents directly into Veda's trembling hands. Veda, I said, leaning closely into the microphone so my final words would echo perfectly in her ears. You have just been officially served with a formal commercial eviction notice and a massive civil lawsuit for gross financial embezzlement. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property before the police arrive to arrest you for trespassing. The absolute destruction of her fraudulent empire was finally complete. The room remained completely motionless for what felt like an eternity. The heavy stack of legal documents trembled in Veda's hands, the crisp white pages rustling softly in the otherwise silent atrium. Her eyes darted frantically across the bold black text, her mind clearly struggling to comprehend the catastrophic reality unfolding before her. But I was not finished. The final nail in the coffin was about to be hammered in. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking directly down at my sister and my parents. I am not just suing you for the money you stole, Veda, I stated, my tone dangerously quiet but perfectly amplified across the entire floor. By illegally transferring massive sums of money across state lines from an Illinois bank to artificially inflate corporate accounts in Massachusetts and deliberately using those manipulated numbers to defraud accredited investors, you have crossed a very serious line. I paused, allowing the gravity of my words to settle heavily over the quiet room. You have crossed into federal jurisdiction. The color drained entirely from Graham's face. He clutched his chest, a look of profound physical pain crossing his features as the reality of his stepdaughter's actions set in. The forensic accounting audit proving your embezzlement has already been submitted directly to the federal authorities, I announced. The FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission have received the entire digital paper trail. You are not going to be a celebrated tech billionaire, Veda. You are going to be indicted for severe federal wire fraud. You are facing years in federal prison. The absolute finality of my statement broke the remaining spell holding the crowd. The wealthy venture capitalists had heard more than enough. They realized immediately that they were standing inside a massive liability, dealing with a desperate, bankrupt family actively committing serious financial crimes. "We are completely done here," a prominent billionaire investor announced loudly, his voice cutting through the remaining silence. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick envelope containing his intended term sheet, and deliberately tore the heavy parchment paper completely in half. He dropped the torn pieces directly onto the plush carpet at Vada's feet. The gesture sparked an immediate mass exodus. The elite crowd collectively turned their backs on the stage, moving swiftly and purposefully toward the exit doors and the elevator banks. They abandoned their crystal champagne flutes on the catering tables and ignored the expensive warm appetizers. The grand atrium, which had been buzzing with immense wealth just 20 minutes ago, was rapidly emptying out in total silence. Veda stood completely paralyzed, watching her entire dream evaporate before her very eyes. The investors she had desperately courted, the funding she desperately needed, and the prestigious reputation she had ruthlessly cultivated were all walking out the heavy glass doors forever. The devastating reality of her total failure finally crushed the remaining arrogance out of her. She spun around, her breathing shallow and rapid, and looked wildly at my mother. "Mom," Veda pleaded, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "Mom, you have to help me fix this. Tell them it was your idea to move the money. Tell them I did not know. You have to take the blame for the wire transfer." Delia stared at her golden child, her beautiful features twisted into a mask of pure horror and revulsion. The reality of the situation had clearly shattered her own delusions of grandeur. She was not looking at a brilliant tech founder anymore. She was looking at a bankrupt criminal who was actively trying to throw her own mother under the bus to avoid federal prison. "Do not you dare try to drag me into this," Delia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the rapidly emptying room. Her carefully cultivated maternal demeanor entirely dissolved into raw, selfish panic. "I only transferred the money because you begged me to. You told me it was a guaranteed investment. You lied to me about everything. I am not going to federal prison because you are a pathetic, incompetent fraud." My mother turned on her heel, grabbing Graham's arm as he continued to clutch his chest, and they practically ran toward the private elevator banks. They abandoned Veda without a second thought, leaving a resounding thud as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them. Veda was left entirely alone, standing on the plush custom carpet under the bright amber lighting. The massive presentation screens behind the stage still displayed the undeniable proof of her corporate fraud for everyone to clearly see. She slowly sank to her knees right there on the floor, her head buried deep in her trembling hands. I stood on the stage, looking down at the wreckage of my toxic family. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I turned my back on my sister, walked gracefully toward my private elevator, and left her to face the absolute destruction she had brought upon herself. Within 24 hours of the gala, the severe fallout began to spread like wildfire across the entire financial district. The elite investors who had attended the event immediately contacted the federal authorities to report the massive discrepancies in the pitch deck I had publicly exposed. By Monday morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially opened a formal investigation into Veda Tech Properties. A highly coordinated team of federal agents arrived at my commercial skyscraper early in the day. Richard, my executive property manager, personally escorted them directly to the 40th floor. They seized every single computer server, filing cabinet, and digital hard drive they could possibly locate within the premises. The once glamorous tech headquarters was completely reduced to a restricted crime scene within a matter of hours. My property management team legally changed the locks on all 3 floors and terminated the commercial lease permanently. Veda was entirely locked out of her own company, and her stolen funds were completely frozen by the government authorities. Without access to the money she had maliciously embezzled, Veda could not afford to pay her software engineers or retain an expensive legal team. She was forced to file for immediate personal and corporate bankruptcy. Holden, my brilliant corporate attorney, worked flawlessly with the federal prosecutors, providing them with the exact forensic accounting ledgers we had painstakingly gathered. The financial evidence was completely irrefutable and thoroughly documented. Veda was formally indicted on multiple counts of severe wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. She was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. The arrogant woman who had demanded I pack my bags and called me a peasant was now sleeping on a terrible mattress in a cheap holding facility, waiting for her criminal trial to begin. She had lost her freedom and her dignity completely. The news of the federal indictment shattered the remaining arrogance of my parents entirely. Delia and Graham had returned to Chicago in absolute disgrace. As the harsh reality of their golden child going to federal prison finally set in, they panicked uncontrollably. They realized that Veda had no money left to defend herself against the massive federal charges. In a desperate attempt to save her, Graham and Delia were forced to sell their expensive cars, liquidate their retirement accounts, and put the very suburban house they had tried to kick me out of on the market, just to afford a basic defense attorney for Veda. They were left with absolutely nothing. Suddenly, my personal cell phone began to ring endlessly throughout the day. I watched my mother's name flash on the screen multiple times, but I never answered a single call. She resorted to leaving desperate, tearful voicemails that went on for several minutes. She begged me to show mercy to my own sister. She pleaded with me to use my massive inheritance to hire a premium defense team to save Veda from a lengthy incarceration. She cried loudly into the phone about how she had always loved me, how families needed to stick together, and how I needed to forgive them for their minor mistakes. The sheer hypocrisy of her sudden affection was staggering to witness. This was the exact same woman who had spent 34 years treating me like a compliant servant, who had actively encouraged her golden child to steal my home, and who had deliberately drained the medical fund for her own grandchildren without a second thought. I sat in the quiet kitchen of my Chicago home, listening to her pathetic pleas one final time. I felt absolutely no guilt and no anger toward her anymore. The emotional hold that toxic family had over me was completely severed and gone forever. I calmly deleted every single voice message without responding to a single one of her frantic requests. I contacted my cellular service provider and permanently changed my phone number, ensuring that Delia, Graham, and Veda could never reach me again. I instructed Holden to send them a formal cease and desist letter, threatening severe legal action if they ever attempted to contact me or my children in the future. I also filed a permanent restraining order against all three of them. I severed all ties completely and decisively. They had made their malicious choices, and now they were left to deal with the absolute destruction they had brought upon themselves without my help. I packed my belongings into neat cardboard boxes, preparing to leave the suburban house and the painful memories behind forever. My children and I were packing our bags and moving to Boston to start a completely new, beautiful life together. 6 months passed since the night of the dramatic gala and the subsequent fallout. The bitter cold winter had gracefully faded into a bright, warm spring across the sprawling city of Boston. I stood on the expansive private balcony of my luxury penthouse apartment, letting the gentle morning breeze wash over my face. The glowing, magnificent skyline stretched out endlessly before me, creating a sea of glass and steel that beautifully caught the early golden sunlight. I held a simple ceramic mug of black coffee, savoring the profound silence and tranquility of my new daily reality. The constant anxiety and emotional exhaustion that had heavily defined my previous life were entirely gone from my mind and body. In their place was a deep, unwavering sense of absolute peace and quiet confidence. I was no longer the underestimated, invisible daughter desperately trying to please a deeply toxic family who systematically minimized my worth. I had fully stepped into my true identity as Maren Vance, the sole owner of Oakwood Holdings and a formidable, respected corporate titan in the commercial real estate world. The 3 floors of my massive commercial skyscraper that had once housed the fraudulent operations of Veda Tech Properties looked entirely different now. After Veda was legally evicted and indicted, I absolutely refused to simply lease the premium space to another generic corporate tenant. I wanted to build something highly meaningful, something that actively combated the toxic, arrogant culture that my sister had perfectly represented. I poured my extensive resources and personal vision into a massive custom architectural renovation. The 40th, 41st, and 42nd floors were completely transformed into a state-of-the-art business incubator and collaborative working space. But this specific environment was incredibly exclusive and highly targeted. It was dedicated entirely to funding and supporting female-led startups and providing comprehensive professional resources for single mothers re-entering the demanding corporate workforce. I meticulously designed every single detail of the new incubator myself, utilizing my extensive professional background in architectural drafting to maximize utility and comfort. The dark, intimidating executive suites that Veda had built were entirely replaced with bright, open, collaborative spaces filled with natural sunlight, indoor plants, and comfortable ergonomic furniture. We built a fully staffed premium childcare center directly on the 41st floor, ensuring that ambitious mothers could focus entirely on building their creative businesses without the crushing daily stress of finding safe, reliable supervision for their young children. I established a massive venture capital grant program using a strategic portion of my financial inheritance, specifically designed to provide essential seed funding to brilliant women who are routinely overlooked by traditional male-dominated investment firms. The sprawling 3-floor space was now constantly humming with genuine technological innovation, mutual professional support, and incredible female empowerment. It was a beautiful living testament to resilience and the absolute power of starting over. My own children, Leo and Maya, were thriving beautifully in their new dynamic environment. They had adjusted to our new life in the busy city with remarkable childhood resilience and endless curiosity. I had proudly enrolled them in an excellent, prestigious private school just a few quiet blocks away from our penthouse apartment. We spent our long weekends exploring sprawling art museums, walking happily through the lush green paths of the public gardens, and eating sweet ice cream on the historic stone steps of famous city monuments. They no longer had to witness the passive-aggressive emotional tension that used to heavily permeate our former suburban home. They were now constantly surrounded by absolute unconditional love and unwavering daily support from me and our new diverse community of friends. I had successfully secured an untouchable, beautiful future for both of them, ensuring they would never have to depend on anyone else for their financial security or their personal happiness as they grew up. I took another slow, deep sip of my warm coffee, watching the massive city slowly wake up and come alive below my balcony. I thought quietly about the sad, exhausted woman I had been exactly a year ago. A woman who had quietly sacrificed her own agency growth, who had willingly drained her personal savings, who had accepted systematic verbal abuse just to keep a deeply broken family intact. I did not feel any pity for her as I reflected on the past. I respected her immensely because her silent endurance and quiet sacrifices had ultimately forged the absolute iron strength I possess today. Every single painful moment of betrayal, every desperate tear shed on the cold hallway floor, every cruel insult hurled by Delia, and every arrogant, condescending smirk from Veda had been absolutely necessary for my personal evolution. They were the harsh emotional catalysts that finally forced me to discover the immense, unyielding power I had always carried silently inside me. The sweetest revenge was not just watching my enemies fall, but completely removing them from my universe and building a beautiful empire where their toxicity could never reach me again. I turned away from the breathtaking, inspiring view of the Boston skyline and walked back inside my peaceful home, perfectly ready and excited to begin another incredible day of shaping my own destiny. I refused to save my mother and my biological sister from federal prison and total poverty. Sometimes I wonder, was I too ruthless, or did I simply let them eat the bitter fruit they planted with their own two hands? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate family revenge and building a new legacy, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible Reddit stories. Thank you so much for watching, and always remember your true worth.